Under the glitter of crystal chandeliers and the hum of soft jazz, Clara Bennett stood perfectly still, though inside something was breaking. The ballroom smelled of roses and expensive perfume, laughter echoing against marble walls. It should have been a night of celebration, until her husband raised his glass, and in front of hundreds, declared his love for someone else. The world went quiet. A glass slipped from her hand, red wine spilling like a wound on white stone. Every flash of the camera burned her face brighter than the shame in her chest. But Clara didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply looked at him, steady and calm, and whispered words that silenced even the cruelest whispers around them. That night, as the music kept playing for everyone else, she walked out into the cold, her heart in pieces but her dignity intact. What she didn't know was that beyond that storm of humiliation waited something unexpected, a stranger watching from the shadows of that same ballroom, a man whose quiet gaze would one day see her not as broken, but as the most beautiful thing reborn. And that was how her story truly began. Soft jazz drifted through the ballroom, slow and velvety, wrapping around the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Golden light shimmered off the chandeliers above, scattering across polished marble floors like scattered stars. Every detail was perfect, every dress, every smile except the one worn by Clara Bennett. She stood near the edge of the crowd, a half-filled glass of red wine in her hand, the color deep and heavy, like the thoughts pressing on her chest. Her husband, Jonathan Reed, was across the room, surrounded by people. He thrived there among cameras and handshakes, where attention felt like air. Clara had long learned to stand quietly in his shadow, smiling when expected, nodding when necessary. Tonight was supposed to be about generosity, a charity gala for the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. She had chosen the theme, arranged the silent auction, even selected the menu. Every inch of this night carried her touch, but no one knew that. To them, she was simply Jonathan Reed's wife. The orchestra swelled. Someone tapped a microphone, calling for silence. Jonathan stood on the small stage, his tuxedo crisp, his smile effortless. Cameras turned toward him, their flashes like tiny storms of light. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth and practiced. "Thank you for your generosity tonight. It's been an extraordinary evening." Clara smiled automatically, waiting for him to finish his speech, but then his tone shifted lighter, almost nervous. "And before we close," he said, glancing toward the crowd, "there's something personal I'd like to share." The audience hushed. A few whispered, curious. Clara's heart skipped, a faint tremor of unease running through her. Jonathan turned, extending his hand. "Sophie, could you come up here for a moment?" The room stirred. A young woman, his assistant, moved through the tables. Sophie Lane. She couldn't have been more than 27, her silver gown shimmering as if it belonged to a different world. Clara's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Jonathan smiled, that charming, public smile everyone adored. "I've learned that life is too short to wait for happiness," he said, voice full of theatrical warmth. "And tonight, in front of everyone I respect, I want to be honest about mine." The glass trembled in Clara's hand. The orchestra fell silent, the kind of silence that hums before something shatters. Jonathan turned toward Sophie, took her hand, and dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone clapped too soon, awkwardly. Flashbulbs exploded. Clara couldn't breathe. He was smiling. "Sophie Lane," he said, "will you marry me for a moment?" Clara thought she'd misheard him. Her mind couldn't piece the words together. The wineglass slipped from her hand, striking the floor with a sharp crack. Red spread across the marble like blood blooming in water. The sound echoed, every head turned, every camera found her. Jonathan froze, still kneeling, his perfect smile faltering. Sophie's face flushed crimson. The silence felt endless. Clara stared at the broken glass, at the red stains spreading toward her shoes. She wanted to move, but her body refused. All she could hear was the faint hiss of cameras, the quiet gasps, and the hollow pounding of her heart. Someone whispered her name. Someone else reached for her arm. She took one slow breath. The air tasted like metal. Then she straightened her shoulders. Her voice came out calm, steady so soft it cut through the noise. "You didn't humiliate me, Jonathan," she said, her eyes on him. "Not the crowd. You only revealed yourself." The words floated in the stillness like smoke. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, she turned, the hem of her gown brushing against the marble as she walked toward the exit. No rush, no tears, just quiet steps through a maze of shocked faces. Outside, the night was cold. Wind moved through the palms, carrying the distant sound of city traffic. Clara stepped into the darkness, wrapping her arms around herself. From inside, applause erupted again because the world keeps moving, even when yours has stopped. Her driver hurried toward her, umbrella in hand, but she shook her head. "It's fine," she murmured. Rain had started to fall soft at first, then heavier. She tilted her face upward, letting it blur the makeup, the glitter, the fragments of what used to be. Somewhere inside that building, her old life continued to sparkle under chandelier light. But out here, beneath the rain, something else began, something small and trembling, like a pulse returning after a long silence. In the reflection of the wet pavement, she caught her own eyes, tired, hurt, but alive. And just before she climbed into the car, she felt a strange sensation like someone was watching, not with pity, but with quiet recognition. Across the street, beneath the awning of a nearby hotel, a man stood alone, his hands in his pockets. The rain caught in his dark hair, but he didn't move. His gaze followed her, not the scandal, not the noise, but the woman who had walked away with grace when the world expected her to crumble. Clara didn't notice him for long, just a flicker, a presence in the blur of rain and light. Yet something about it made her heart slow, steady. As the car door closed and the city lights streaked past the window, she didn't know that one shattered night would be the quiet beginning of everything that was meant for her. Because sometimes, the moment you lose everything is the moment the right eyes finally see you. Rain still traced down the window like thin silver veins when Clara reached home. The city beyond was a blur, neon, headlights, and everything she no longer belonged to. Inside, silence waited for her. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence that fills a space when truth has been spoken aloud. She slipped off her heels, one by one. The marble floor was cold under her bare feet. Her reflection followed her across the glass walls of the living room. Same woman, same face. But something had shifted. Something inside her had cracked open and, strangely, let in air. She poured herself a glass of water and sat on the couch, still in her gown. Her phone buzzed endlessly, messages, calls, notifications. The video was already everywhere. The perfect wife abandoned at a charity gala. The broken glass. The calm voice. "You didn't humiliate me, Jonathan. You revealed yourself." Her words were spreading faster than her shame ever could. She set the phone face down. For the first time in years, she didn't want to explain or defend herself. The rain outside kept falling, a soft, endless percussion against the glass. Clara leaned back, eyes half closed, the image of Jonathan on one knee replayed behind her eyelids. Not the betrayal itself, but the look of confusion that flickered across his face when she didn't collapse, when she didn't scream. That look, that tiny moment, was the first time she'd felt free. Somewhere deep in her chest, dignity stirred like something long forgotten, waking from sleep. She rose and walked through the quiet house. Everything smelled of money and polish, but not of home. The photos on the wall, award dinners, vacations, Magazine covers felt like museum pieces from another life. In one picture, she was smiling beside Jonathan, her hand on his arm, her eyes dimmed behind the flash. She took the frame down and placed it face down on the table. The small sound of it touching the wood felt like punctuation. In the dressing room, she caught her reflection again, mascara streaked, hair tangled, but her posture steady. The woman in the mirror looked older, stronger somehow. She didn't need to ask why he did it. She already knew. Power liked to feed on silence, and she had been silent for too long. Her phone buzzed again, her best friend, Laura. The message was simple. You were brilliant. Everyone's talking about you. Clara smiled, a faint, tired curve of her lips. It didn't feel like brilliance. It felt like survival. She changed into a robe and walked to the balcony. The Pacific stretched out below, dark and endless. The air smelled of rain and salt. She stood there, breathing slowly, listening to the waves hit the rocks. It was strange how grief and peace could sound so similar when the world finally went quiet. A car engine roared somewhere down the hill. She imagined Jonathan leaving the gala, furious, confused, maybe already crafting a story for the press. But she wouldn't read it. Not this time. Not ever again. Inside, she found her sketchbook tucked in a drawer, a relic from years ago, when she used to draw floor plans and dream of designing homes that made people feel safe. She brushed dust from the cover and opened it. The pages smelled faintly of graphite and old hope. Lines of half-finished ideas stared back at her bridges of light. Open rooms, gardens between walls. Her fingers moved slowly, tracing the pencil strokes she once believed in. For years, she'd buried this part of herself under dinner parties, designer dresses, and a man's ambition. Now, in the stillness of midnight, she felt that forgotten pulse again. The part of her that built, not followed. A flash of lightning cut through the clouds, lighting up the room for a brief, silent second. The sound that followed rolled low and distant. Clara whispered to no one, "It's over." Then, after a breath, softer still, "And it's beginning." The night deepened. She turned off every light except one, the small lamp by her desk. Its glow was warm, almost human. She sat there, pencil in hand, not to design something yet, but to remember how it felt to create. Lines began to appear again, hesitant at first, then steady. Each stroke seemed to stitch something inside her back together. Hours passed. The storm eased. When she finally looked up, dawn had started brushing the horizon in pale blue. Her fingers were smudged with graphite, her heart strangely light. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small inside her own life. In the reflection of the window, the woman staring back at her wasn't a wife, or a victim, or a headline. She was simply herself. Clara closed the sketchbook gently, holding it to her chest. She didn't know what came next, only that whatever it was, it would be hers. She stood and opened the balcony doors again. The sea was calm now. The first sunlight shimmered across the waves, catching on the edges of broken clouds. She whispered a quiet, "Thank you not to anyone, but to the silence that had stayed with her all night." Patient and kind, somewhere far behind her, the world was still talking. But here, in this moment, the only sound was the ocean breathing, steady and alive. And as the light grew, Clara smiled not because she had healed, not yet, but because she finally knew where to begin. Outside, a single gull flew across the morning sky, its wings slicing through the soft air. The sight lingered in her eyes as if promising something she couldn't name yet. She watched until it disappeared into the horizon, then turned back inside, whispering to herself half a vow, half a prayer. "Never again will I let anyone tell me who I am." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and possibility. Something inside her answered, quiet but certain. The storm had passed, and in its wake, dignity had taken root. Morning light spilled through the tall windows, brushing the walls of Clara's Malibu home in soft gold. The ocean beyond was calm again, breathing against the shore like a living thing. She stood in the center of the empty living room, barefoot, surrounded by boxes she hadn't opened since the move. The house still echoed every step, returned to her like a faint memory. Somewhere, a gull cried. The sound carried a kind of loneliness that wasn't cruel, only honest. She walked to one of the boxes marked old papers, pulling the tape loose. Inside were pieces of her other life drawings, notebooks, rulers with fading marks. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the first sketch, a pencil outline of a glass-roofed atrium bathed in natural light. She had drawn it years ago, before Jonathan, before the business dinners and the manicured life that had turned her into a beautiful shadow. For a long while, she just looked at the page. Dust motes drifted in the air, moving through sunlight like slow snow. The lines were uneven, imperfect, but they were hers. A warmth spread through her chest. Not happiness exactly, more like recognition. She laid the sketches on the floor one by one, the way a child might arrange puzzle pieces. A home, a library, a courtyard surrounded by vines. The forgotten language of her dreams returned in fragments shapes. Balance, light. She knelt down, tracing the edge of one with her fingertip, and whispered, "I remember this." Outside, the ocean kept its rhythm. Inside, something in her began to move again. By noon, she had opened every box, papers, design tools, rolls of tracing film, small survivors of a life she once believed she had outgrown. She found an old mechanical pencil, scratched and dull, and smiled. She pressed its tip against a blank sheet and began to draw. The first line shook, but the next found its courage. Her hand remembered what her heart had almost forgotten. The hours passed, the room filled with the soft whisper of graphite. A breeze slipped through the open window, lifting the corner of the pages. Time stopped meaning anything. When the sun dipped lower, painting the room in amber, she leaned back. The sketch before her wasn't perfect, but it was real. It felt like breathing again after holding her breath for years. Clara stood and stretched, her back aching slightly. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of cold water, and leaned against the counter. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel proud not for being strong or graceful or composed, but simply for beginning. Her phone buzzed again. Messages from reporters, invitations to interviews, strangers praising her powerful words. She turned the screen face down. The world could wait. Right now. She had work to do. That night, the Malibu sky cleared completely. Stars blinked faintly over the dark water. Clara sat by the window with her sketchbook open on her knees. She could hear the ocean, steady and eternal. The sound had always comforted her as a girl. When her world felt too small, she thought of that girl now, barefoot, curious, fearless, and whispered, "You're still here?" She looked around the half-empty house. It no longer felt like a museum of failure, but like a blank canvas. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was space for something new to grow. She spent the next few days sorting through everything she owned, gowns wrapped in plastic, glittering jewelry. Event invitations all went into donation boxes. By the fourth morning, the house was nearly bare. What remained were the essentials: her coffee mug, her sketching tools, her courage. She started rising early. At dawn, she would take her coffee out to the deck, breathe in the salt air, and watch the horizon shift from blue to gold. Then she'd go inside and draw. Each morning brought a new idea. Tiny studios, reading nooks, quiet spaces for children to paint. She didn't know what it would become yet, but it felt like building a bridge back to herself. One afternoon, while rummaging through an old portfolio, she found a letter tucked between two sheets. It was from her college professor, written the year she'd left school to marry Jonathan. "Clara, you have an instinct for light," it read. "Never forget that spaces only matter when they let people breathe." Her throat tightened. She closed her eyes and pressed the paper to her chest. Maybe it wasn't too late to start again. The following weekend, she visited a local supply shop in Santa Monica. The man behind the counter, gray-haired and kind-eyed, helped her choose drafting paper and pencils. When she handed him her card, he looked up. "You're Clara Bennett." "Right, I saw that video." "What you said." He paused, smiling softly. "It was brave." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "It wasn't bravery," she said quietly. "It was the truth." Driving home, she rolled down the window and let the wind whip through her hair. The freeway curved along the coast, and for the first time in months, she felt light. Back home, she spent the evening redrawing an old concept she once loved, a small art center by the sea, filled with light, designed for people who thought they had no place to belong. She worked until midnight, the sound of the waves keeping her company. When she finally stopped, she stepped outside again. The moon was high, silvering the water. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stood there, barefoot on the cool wood. The air smelled of rain again, faint and distant. She whispered, almost as if afraid to break the spell. "This time, I'll build something that lasts." The sea answered with a low hush against the sand, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the whole world had heard her promise. Inside, her sketches lay across the table, pages glowing under the soft lamp, each one a small act of defiance, each line a thread stitching her life back together. Clara lingered by the doorway, looking at them as if they might vanish when she turned away. But they didn't. They stayed. She smiled gentle, unguarded, the way she hadn't smiled in years. Then she turned off the light, letting the moon finish what she had started. Outside, the tide moved in closer, washing the shore clean. Tomorrow, she would wake up and draw again. And somewhere, out beyond the horizon, life was already preparing its next chapter for her, quietly, patiently, as it always does for those who dare to begin again. The morning began like any other. Coffee, the quiet scrape of the pencil across paper, the sea breathing against the cliffs below her window. But that day, the air felt different, sharp, expectant, as if something unseen was about to arrive. Clara sat at her small desk, sketching a skylight design when her laptop chimed. A new email. She ignored it at first. Most messages these days were noise requests for interviews, sponsorship offers, people who wanted a piece of her calm because they didn't know how much it had cost her. Yet something about this one stopped her hand mid-stroke. The subject line was simple. "A project. For you." She clicked it open. The sender's name read Alexander Pierce. The message was brief, almost formal. He wrote that he owned an old estate in Vermont, Willowcrest Manor, and was searching for someone to restore its private library, a project originally designed by his late mother. He had seen the video from the Gala, not for the spectacle, but because, he wrote, "There was grace in how you stood in ruin. I believe you understand what it means to rebuild something that once had a soul." Clara read the lines again, slower this time. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. Vermont, a library, restoration. It sounded too grand, too strange, and yet there was something gentle in his tone. Not pity, not curiosity, just quiet recognition. She leaned back in her chair, the sound of the ocean faint behind her. Who was Alexander Pierce? She typed the name into a search bar and found almost nothing personal. A few mentions in Art Foundation records, an interview in an old architecture magazine where he spoke about preserving historic spaces. The photo beside the article showed a man in his 40s, clean lines in his face, a look both distant and thoughtful. Still, it could be anyone, a prank, a scam, but the letter didn't read like a trick. It felt human. She hesitated another day before replying. Her answer was cautious, polite, short. "Thank you for reaching out. Mr. Pierce, could you please share more details about the project?" His reply came within the hour. The library was part of his mother's private collection, untouched for decades. The restoration, he said, wasn't about profit or publicity. It was about honoring memory. He offered to cover all travel and accommodation expenses, and attached photos of the room, tall arched windows, dust-covered shelves, a skylight broken by ivy. Clara stared at those images until evening fell. Something inside her stirred the same spark she'd felt when she'd first rediscovered her sketches, that longing to bring light into forgotten places. She printed the photos and pinned them to the corkboard above her desk. Each one seemed to whisper, "Come see." That night, sleep wouldn't come. The waves outside sounded louder, restless, like a reminder that sometimes change arrives quietly, wrapped in the ordinary. Around midnight, she rose and stood at the window. The sky was clear, stars spilled wide across the black. She whispered to the reflection in the glass, "Maybe it's time." The next morning, she booked her flight. When she arrived in Vermont, the world looked different. The air was colder, scented with pine and distant wood smoke. Willowcrest Manor appeared at the end of a long gravel drive, wrapped in mist. Stone walls, tall oaks, a roof dark with age. The kind of beauty that had stopped trying to impress anyone. A man waited at the entrance broad-shouldered, dressed simply in a charcoal coat. His eyes caught hers as she stepped out of the car. Calm, searching. Not the gaze of a man who wanted to be seen, but of someone who had already seen too much. "Ms. Bennett." His voice was low, steady. "Clara," she said softly. He nodded. "Welcome to Willowcrest." He led her through echoing halls, their silence filled with the scent of dust and wood polish. Paintings lined the corridor, landscapes washed in muted color, some of them half faded. When they reached the library doors, Alexander paused before pushing them open. This was her world, he said quietly. She used to spend hours here, reading under the skylight. It collapsed during a storm 5 years ago. I couldn't bring myself to fix it. The doors groaned as they opened. Inside, light poured through broken glass, falling in slanted beams that turned the dust into slow-moving stars. Shelves rose to the ceiling, filled with books that had long forgotten touch. A piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed. The air was thick with time. Clara stepped inside. The wood creaked under her feet. She ran her hand along a row of books, her fingertips gathering the fine grit of years. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Alexander watched her, his hands clasped behind his back. "Can you bring it back?" She turned toward him. "It's not gone," she said, "just waiting for the first time." He smiled, a small, hesitant thing that changed his face completely. They spent the afternoon walking through the space, discussing possibilities. She sketched quickly, tracing light angles, window frames, how the shadows shifted. He watched in silence, occasionally offering a memory, a book his mother loved, a chair she refused to replace. There was reverence in his voice when he spoke of her, and Clara felt something soften in her chest. As the sun began to sink, the room glowed amber. Clara stood by the shattered skylight, gazing upward. A single leaf drifted down, landing on her sketchbook. She smiled. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Alexander hesitated. "Because I saw someone who didn't hide when everything fell apart." He said, "My mother would have trusted a person like that." Clara looked down at her hands, the same hands that had once trembled at a gala, that had learned to hold pencils instead of wine glasses. Maybe this was what rebuilding looked like. Not grandeur, not revenge, just work. Honest, quiet work. When she left the library that evening, the hallway lamps flickered to life one by one. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing fields glowing under the last light. She paused at the doorway, inhaling the scent of earth and old rain. Behind her, Alexander's footsteps slowed. "You'll stay on the property while you work. The East Wing has been prepared for you. It's simple, but peaceful." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly what I need." He smiled again, faintly, then turned away, as she followed the path toward her quarters. The night gathered gently around her. The manor loomed behind, its windows glinting faintly. She felt both small and strangely at home. When she reached the room, she set her bag down and opened the window. The scent of pine and soil drifted in. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her sketchbook in her lap, and let herself breathe. She could feel that quiet stirring again. The sense that maybe this wasn't just a project, but a passage. She looked out at the dark outline of Willowcrest and whispered, "All right, then, let's begin." Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, soft and knowing, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The morning mist still clung to the fields when Clara crossed the stone path toward the library. Dew glimmered on the grass like tiny shards of glass. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, low and rough, and the sound dissolved into the hush of the countryside. She pushed the heavy oak doors open. The hinges groaned softly, a sound like time remembering itself. Inside, dust floated through slanted beams of light. It smelled of paper, wood, and something faintly sweet, maybe lavender, or maybe just memory. She stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. Then she heard it, the quiet shuffle of footsteps behind her. Alexander Pierce appeared at the far end of the room, carrying a small wooden box. Morning light fell across his face, outlining the lines near his eyes, lines carved not by age, but by the kind of solitude that lives too long in a person. His hair was dark with a touch of gray at the temples. His movements were calm, deliberate, like someone who had learned to measure the world by heartbeats, not clocks. He didn't speak right away, neither did she. The air between them felt suspended, fragile but not uncomfortable. Finally, he said, "You're here early." Clara smiled faintly. "I wanted to see it in the morning light." He nodded, setting the box on a nearby table. "It's different then. Softer. My mother used to say the library woke up with the sun." She walked toward the tall windows, her fingertips brushing the dusty shelves. "It's beautiful, even in ruin." He glanced at her, then at the shelves. "That's generous. Most people just see decay." "Decay has its own kind of beauty," she said quietly. "It means something once lived." Something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, exactly, but recognition. The kind that passes silently between two people who have known different kinds of loss but speak the same language of it. They spent a long while walking through the room together. He showed her the places where the ceiling had caved, where rain had bled through old wallpaper, leaving faded trails like veins. She took notes, sketched measurements, occasionally pausing to listen as he shared small fragments of memory, his mother reading aloud from a velvet chair, his father's piano echoing through the hall on winter nights. When he spoke of her, his voice softened in a way that made Clara look up from her notepad. The way he said "mother" sounded like prayer. At one point, he reached for a fallen book and brushed the dust from its spine. The Architecture of Light. The title made Clara smile. She loved that one, he said, handing it to her. Clara opened it carefully. Between its pages was a dried sprig of lavender, pressed flat by time. The scent rose faintly into the air. She closed the book slowly, as if afraid to disturb the quiet. "It feels like she's still here," she murmured. "She is," he said simply. They stood there in the hush, the weight of years folding around them. No words seemed needed. Some silences aren't empty, they're full, holding everything you don't yet know how to say. After a while, Clara pulled out her pencil and began sketching. The lines came easily now, the angle of light through the broken skylight, the way it spilled onto the marble floor like a pale river. Alexander watched her work, saying nothing. He noticed how focused she became, how her brow furrowed slightly when she measured distance with her eyes. She moved with quiet confidence, as if rebuilding wasn't a task, but a prayer. When she finished a rough outline, she turned to him. "What do you want it to feel like when it's done?" He thought for a moment. "Alive," he said. "Not perfect, just alive again." She nodded. Then we'll start there. For the first time since she arrived, he smiled fully. It wasn't the polite smile of introduction, but something deeper, unpracticed, real. It lingered in the corners of his face even after he turned away. Outside, the wind had picked up. Branches brushed against the windows like fingertips. Clara gathered her sketches and looked around one last time before leaving. The light had shifted, golden now, scattering across the floorboards in long stripes. She caught sight of Alexander standing by the piano, one hand resting on its closed lid. The image stayed with her, the solitary man, the broken room, both waiting quietly for restoration. That evening, as she unpacked her things in the small East Wing room he had prepared, she found her thoughts returning to the library again and again, to the sound of his voice when he spoke of his mother, to the way their silences seemed to understand each other. She set her pencil down and walked to the window. The manor grounds stretched wide below, bathed in the last color of twilight. Somewhere, a light flickered on in the library. Perhaps he was still there. The thought made her chest tighten, not in sadness, but in something gentler. Recognition, maybe. The same kind that had passed between them earlier. She whispered to herself, "We've both lost things we can't replace." The night deepened around her. She could hear the faint hum of crickets, the low rustle of leaves. Her reflection in the window looked calm, almost content. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like someone rebuilding from ashes. She felt like someone standing at the edge of something new, something fragile but real. Clara turned off the lamp, the room dimming to blue. Outside, the library's single window still glowed faintly in the dark. It reminded her of a heartbeat, steady and quiet, pulsing through the vast silence of Willowcrest. And somehow, she knew that light was calling her back. The days at Willowcrest began to fall into rhythm, quiet, deliberate, almost sacred. Mornings smelled of pine and coffee, afternoons of dust and old paper. The library, once silent and untouched, slowly began to breathe again. And in that slow return to life, something else began to stir, something unspoken between two people who had both learned how to live inside their own silences. Clara spent most mornings sketching under the fractured skylight, her pencils spread out in careful lines beside her. The light changed every hour, and she chased it across the page, trying to understand how it moved, how it softened corners and made shadows kinder. Alexander often joined her without warning. Sometimes he brought her tea, sometimes just quiet company. He had a way of entering a room without disturbing it, like part of the air itself. They talked in pieces about wood, about texture, about his mother's favorite editions of poetry. He told her how his mother had loved Emily Dickinson, how she'd leave notes in the margins, written into faint ink. One afternoon, he handed Clara a small, worn volume. Inside, next to a line that read, "Hope is the thing with feathers," his mother had written. "Never stop building light." Clara traced the handwriting gently. "She must have been remarkable," she said. "She was," Alexander replied, his voice soft. "But I think she was lonely, too." That word hung between them for a moment. Lonely. It didn't need explaining. They both knew its shape. Outside, spring began to unfold in the Vermont hills. The snow melted into quiet rivers, and the air filled with the scent of wet earth. Some afternoons, when the light grew too dim for drawing, Clara would join Alexander on the terrace. They sat with mugs of tea, watching fog drift over the valley. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Both silences felt right. One day, while organizing the stacks of old books, Clara found a box of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. "May I?" she asked. Alexander nodded. "They're hers." The letters were tender, full of small details, weather, garden blooms, half-finished thoughts. Clara read a few, her throat tightening at the last one. "If someday this place feels too heavy, open the windows and let someone else's hands restore it. Beauty deserves more than grief." She closed the letter and looked up. Alexander was watching her quietly. Their eyes met. No words passed. It was enough. In the evenings, Clara returned to her room and worked by lamplight, redrawing sections of the skylight, experimenting with new materials that could honor the old glass but bring in more warmth. She'd hear footsteps in the hallway, sometimes his. Sometimes he'd stop by the door, just to ask how the plans were coming. Better, she'd say. The light finally makes sense, and he'd smile, that small, unguarded smile that came only when he forgot to hide behind his restraint. One afternoon, they were restoring one of the lower shelves together, sanding the wood to bring back its natural sheen. The scent of cedar filled the air. Clara pushed a strand of hair behind her ear, leaving a faint streak of dust on her cheek. Alexander noticed but said nothing. Instead, he handed her a small brush and pointed to the grain. "Follow it," he said. "Don't fight the lines. They've already learned where they want to go." She smiled. "You sound like you're talking about people, not wood." He paused. Maybe both. For a moment, the room held only the soft rasp of sandpaper and the muted light of afternoon. Something about the simplicity of it, two people working side by side, not needing to fill the air, made her heart ache in a way that wasn't pain. It was recognition. Days turned into weeks. The library began to change shape. The dust thinned. Shelves stood straighter. Even the light seemed to linger longer, as if curious about what they were creating. Clara started keeping a notebook of small details, the way he hums under his breath when he reads, how the air smells like rain when the windows open, the sound of pages turning like a heartbeat. One evening, she found him sitting at the piano, his fingers hesitating above the keys. "I didn't know you played," she said. "I don't," he answered with a soft smile. "Not really, but sometimes I try, just to hear what still works." He pressed one key low, resonant, then another. The sound filled the room, shaky but warm. Clara leaned against the doorway, listening. It was imperfect music, the kind that carried its own kind of honesty. When he stopped, she said quietly, "It's beautiful." He looked at her, the faintest trace of surprise in his expression. "You think so, I do." The next morning, she found fresh flowers placed on the library desk, a small bunch of wild violets in a chipped glass jar. There was no note. She didn't need one. In those slow, steady days, the boundaries between their roles blurred. He stopped being her employer. She stopped being just the architect. They became something else, two souls rebuilding something larger than a room. One afternoon, as rain whispered against the windows, Alexander stood beside her at the drafting table. "Do you ever think," he said softly, "that some people are meant to find each other only after they have both been broken?" Clara looked up at him. Her pencil paused above the page. "Maybe," she said, "maybe that's the only way they recognize each other." He nodded, his gaze lingering a moment longer than usual. The rain kept falling, a quiet rhythm against the glass. Clara turned back to her sketch, her heart steady, but her hand trembling slightly as she drew. Something inside her knew that what was growing between them wasn't the kind of love that arrives loudly. It was slower, deeper, the kind that takes root in silence and blooms when no one's watching. When the rain finally stopped, the air outside smelled of earth and cedar. Clara closed her notebook, her voice barely above a whisper. "The light finally feels right." Alexander looked at her, eyes warm. "It does," he said. "It really does." And in that still moment, surrounded by the scent of wet wood and afternoon calm, they both understood this was no longer just about restoring a library. It was about restoring faith. Outside, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, landing right where they stood. Neither moved. The light stayed. The morning began quietly, like all others at Willow Crest. Sunlight slanted through the newly polished windows, painting warm lines across the long table. Clara sat there with her sketches spread out, tracing faint details of the ceiling molding. Outside, the world was just beginning to thaw, birds returning, the air soft with promise. Everything felt steady, safe, but by afternoon, that calm would shatter. It started with an unexpected sound, the faint buzz of her phone. She almost didn't check it, but then she saw the message from Laura, her oldest friend back in Los Angeles. "Clara, is this your boss?" followed by a link. She clicked it. A headline opened in sharp, black letters, Alexander Pierce, tech visionary and CEO of Pierce Dynamics, steps back from the spotlight. Below it, a photo. Him. The same quiet man who had stood beside her sanding a bookshelf 2 days ago, now standing in front of glass towers, surrounded by reporters and flashbulbs. His expression in the photo was distant, formal. The caption read, "Net worth estimated at over $2 billion. Clara's breath caught. The room around her seemed to tilt slightly, the walls pressing closer. She scrolled through paragraphs, talks of innovation, philanthropy, global ventures, words that didn't belong to the man she'd known. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down. All at once, memories from another life returned, the flash of cameras, the weight of expensive rooms, the invisible hierarchy of power. She felt her stomach tighten. She'd left that world behind. She'd promised herself never again. For a long moment, she just stood there, her pulse thudding in her ears. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Alexander's voice gentle, familiar. "You've been working since dawn again." She turned slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" He paused. "Tell you what? That you're not just the owner of Willow Crest," she said, the words barely holding together. "That you're him." He didn't speak right away. His gaze held hers, calm but unreadable. Then, quietly, "I didn't hide it to deceive you. I just wanted this." He gestured around the library to be simple. "Simple," she repeated, a bitter laugh slipping out. "You're a man whose name is printed in magazines. There's nothing simple about that." He took a small step closer, careful, like approaching a wild thing. "I wanted you to see me without the noise," he said, "not the version the world built around me." Clara turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Do you know what that world did to me? Alexander. How it feels to be seen only through someone else's shadow." "I do," he said quietly. But she shook her head, her voice trembling. "You say that, but you can't. You've never had to rebuild yourself from the pieces someone left behind." The silence that followed was deep, aching. Alexander didn't defend himself. He only said, softly, "Then tell me how to be different." Clara closed her eyes, tears burning behind her lids. She wanted to believe him, to believe this was different. But fear has a way of echoing louder than truth. The rest of the day passed in fragments. She worked without focus, her mind circling the same thought. Maybe I've stepped into another kind of cage. When evening came, she stood outside on the terrace, arms wrapped around herself. The valley below was bathed in amber light. Somewhere, she could hear the faint sound of the piano from inside, a single note, then another hesitant, as if unsure if it was welcome. She didn't turn. She just listened. The melody stopped after a few bars. Then his voice barely above a whisper. "Clara." She looked over her shoulder. He stood at the doorway, no pretense in his face, just quiet concern. "I understand if you want to leave," he said, "but I hope you'll stay, not for me, for what you've begun here." She studied him for a long moment. The light behind him framed him not as a powerful man, but as a person, tired, human, real. "You should have told me," she said again, softer this time. "I know," he replied, "but I didn't want my name to stand between us and what's true, and what is true." He hesitated. Then, with the same calm honesty he'd shown since the first day she met him, said, "That I see you. Not what the world says about you. You." The words sank into the quiet between them, fragile and warm. Something inside her shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of her room, the sketches spread out before her. Her eyes fell on one design she'd drawn weeks ago, a beam of light cutting through the broken ceiling, a symbol of rebuilding. She realized now that she had feared his wealth not because of what it meant about him, but because of what it reminded her about herself, how easily she had once surrendered her identity for someone else's world. She wouldn't do that again. When morning came, she went back to the library. Alexander was already there, standing by the ladder, reading through her notes. She walked up beside him, her voice steady. "I'll stay, but not as your guest, as your partner in this project. Equal terms." He turned toward her, a slow, genuine smile forming. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." They stood there in the quiet, the sun filtering through the glass. For the first time, she didn't see him as the mysterious benefactor or the man behind a fortune. She saw him as he was, a man who, like her, was learning how to begin again. As she turned to her sketches, she caught his reflection in the window, his expression soft, content. He wasn't watching her to possess, but to witness. Outside, the wind rustled through the ivy, carrying the scent of rain, and somewhere deep in her chest, Clara felt it, the slow, cautious return of trust. She smiled faintly, tracing a line across the page. "Let's get to work," she said. He nodded. Together, the day moved forward gently, like forgiveness finding its way into light. It was a quiet Sunday morning at Willowcrest. The sky was pale, soft with early spring light. Clara sat by the long oak table in the library, her hair loosely tied, sketches spread around her like fallen leaves. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 9 times. Everything felt still, anchored, almost peaceful. Then the phone rang. The sound sliced through the quiet like glass breaking. Her hand hesitated before she picked it up. The number on the screen was familiar. A ghost she thought she'd buried for good. For a long breath. She didn't move. Then, against her better judgment, she answered. "Clara." The voice was low, slurred, heavy with drink. "Jonathan." She closed her eyes. "What do you want?" He laughed, a sound that carried no joy. "I saw your little news piece. Clara Bennett back from the ashes. How poetic." She stayed silent. "I wonder," he continued, his tone sharpening, "how you manage that. Oh, wait, I know. The billionaire, right? Alexander Pierce." Her pulse quickened. "You don't know what you're talking about?" "I know exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "You're doing what you do best. Finding men with power and pretending it's love." The words hit like old bruises pressed again. She felt her throat tighten. The same mixture of shame and anger that once kept her silent. "Goodbye, Jonathan." But before she could end the call, he spat out. "You can't fool everyone forever. People are talking. They say you found your next meal ticket." The line clicked dead. For a long time, Clara didn't move. The air around her seemed to close in. She felt her hands tremble, though her face stayed composed. It wasn't the insult itself that hurt. It was how familiar it felt. How easily the past could crawl back and try to rewrite the present. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. She stood, pacing the length of the room. Each breath came sharper, quicker. The fear wasn't about Jonathan. It was about what he'd stirred in her. That small, trembling voice that whispered she'd never fully escape the woman she used to be. A soft knock sounded on the doorframe. Alexander stood there, holding 2 mugs of tea. He looked at her and paused. "You're pale." "What happened?" She forced a smile. "Nothing. Just an old mistake reminding me it's still alive." He set the mugs down and waited. He didn't press, didn't demand, just waited. Finally, she said it. "Jonathan called. He's spreading rumors, saying I'm using you." The words tasted bitter. Alexander's face didn't change. His voice was calm, steady. "And do you believe him?" She met his eyes, startled. "Of course not." "Then neither do I." She blinked, uncertain. "Just like that?" "Just like that." He stepped closer, his tone gentle but firm. "I don't live my life through other people's fears. And you don't have to either." Something inside her cracked open. The simplicity of his trust was almost disarming. "But still," she whispered, "you don't know what people are capable of saying when they want to destroy you?" He nodded, then let them talk. "The truth doesn't vanish just because someone shouts louder." She looked at him for a long time, the tightness in her chest slowly loosening. "You're not going to protect me?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, and his voice was softer than before. "You don't need me to." That stopped her. She hadn't realized how much she'd braced herself for the opposite, for someone to take over, to defend her, to step in. But he didn't. He simply stood beside her, solid, unmoving, trusting her to hold her own ground. The silence between them was warm, real. Clara turned away, exhaling slowly. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," he said, "but it's worth it." The next few days passed with a strange mix of tension and calm. The rumors spread quickly. Some gossip blog had picked up Jonathan's words, painting her as a fallen socialite turned opportunist. It stung to see her name twisted again, her story reduced to scandal. But this time, she didn't run. She kept working, sketching, measuring, cleaning dust from the corners of shelves that hadn't been touched in years. The work steadied her. It reminded her who she'd become, the woman who built instead of begged. One evening, while she was organizing the plans for the new skylight, Alexander came into the room, carrying a stack of books. "There's something I want to show you," he said. He handed her a photo, old black and white, of a younger version of his mother standing in the same library. Behind her was an inscription on the wall, faint but visible. "Truth needs no defense." "She had it carved after a scandal nearly ruined my father's name," he said. "She told me once, if you tell the truth and still lose, at least you lose honestly." Clara traced the words in the picture. They felt like an anchor. She looked up at him, her eyes soft. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I have to," he said. "Otherwise I'd never sleep." Outside, the last light of the day slipped behind the hills. The room glowed in twilight, gentle and quiet. Clara felt a strange calm settle in her chest. The world could say what it wanted. The work would keep speaking louder. Later that night, as she closed her sketchbook, she glanced toward the library window. Alexander stood there, half in shadow, looking out at the valley below. He didn't see her watching. For the first time since that phone call, she felt peace, not because the storm had passed, but because she finally understood she could stand in the rain and not break. She whispered into the stillness, "Thank you." He turned slightly. Hearing her, though, she hadn't spoken loud enough. Their eyes met across the dim room. He didn't smile, but there was something in his gaze, a quiet assurance, a steady presence. And that was enough. The night grew darker, but the library stayed lit, warm and golden against the cold outside. In the soft hum of silence, two people worked side by side, not to erase the past, but to build something stronger than what had been lost. And for Clara, that was the first time in years she realized dignity doesn't come from who stands beside you. It comes from the moment you choose to stand alone and still be whole. The morning of the charity reception at Willowcrest arrived with a kind of fragile beauty. The air was cool and clear, the grounds blooming with early summer flowers. Guests had begun to gather in the courtyard: patrons, artists, scholars, people invited to see the progress of the library's restoration. Clara stood by the tall windows, smoothing the fabric of her dress, her palms slightly damp. It wasn't vanity that made her nervous. It was the weight of what this day meant. The library was finally whole again, alive, breathing, and for the first time, she felt the same. Outside, voices carried on the wind, laughter, the soft clinking of glasses. Alexander was speaking with one of the donors near the fountain, his presence steady and graceful. He looked toward the library once, catching Clara's gaze through the glass. A small nod, wordless encouragement. She smiled, took a slow breath, and stepped out into the sunlight. The event unfolded easily at first. People admired her work, asking about design choices, materials, how she managed to preserve the original warmth of the room. Clara answered with quiet confidence, her voice calm but alive with pride. Alexander stood nearby, not overshadowing her, just listening content to let her shine. It was just as the speeches began that the world tilted. A flash of movement near the gate caught her eye. Someone pushing through the crowd, moving too fast, too loud. Then came the voice. Of course she's impressive. She's always been good at making rich men believe in fairy tales. The laughter stopped. Heads turned. Jonathan. He was thinner than before, his skin sallow, his suit wrinkled, his eyes glassy with drink. He reeked of desperation more than alcohol, but both clung to him like a second skin. Security hesitated, unsure. He was, after all, a familiar name in certain circles. He stumbled forward, pointing at her, his voice rising. Look at her, the fallen wife, now reborn thanks to another man's money. You never change, Clara. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Clara felt every eye on her, the same piercing weight she'd once known so well. Her hands trembled for a heartbeat, then steadied. She didn't move. Alexander's posture shifted slightly, ready to step forward, but she raised her hand just enough to stop him. Her gaze remained fixed on Jonathan. "Jonathan," she said softly, the calm in her tone startling even herself. "You shouldn't be here," he sneered. "Why not? You should thank me. Without me, you wouldn't even know how to play this game." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered her name. Someone else whispered his. But Clara didn't flinch. She walked toward him slowly, her heels clicking against the stone. The sound was the only rhythm in the hush. "You think you can hurt me by dragging me through the dirt again," she said quietly, close enough now that only the first few rows could hear clearly. "But you can't. Because I don't live there anymore." He blinked, thrown off by her stillness. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, her voice low but clear, "you can't wound someone who stopped being afraid of you." The words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with the same quiet strength that had once silenced an entire ballroom. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though the weight of her composure had stolen his vocabulary. His face flushed red. "You think you're better than me?" "No," she said simply. "Just free." That broke something in him. He took a step back, unsteady. Security moved in then, gently but firmly, steering him toward the exit. He didn't resist, just laughed a hollow, broken sound and muttered something no one caught. The silence that followed was different now, thick with awe, not pity. Clara turned slowly to face the guests, her pulse loud in her ears. "I'm sorry for the interruption," she said softly, "but perhaps it's fitting, because this project has always been about restoring what's broken. And sometimes, that means facing what cracked you open in the first place." Her voice didn't tremble. Not once. A moment later, applause began quiet at first, then stronger, steady, like rain building on glass. Alexander didn't move toward her. Not yet. He simply stood where he was, his eyes warm, proud not because she'd survived, but because she'd stood. When the crowd began to disperse, Clara stepped back into the library. The late afternoon light filtered through the restored skylight, casting soft gold across the room. She leaned against one of the shelves, exhaling slowly. Her hands were cold, but her heart was steady. She heard footsteps behind her. Alexander didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just stood beside her, close enough for her to feel his quiet presence, but far enough to let her own strength fill the space. She looked at him and whispered, half to herself, "I thought I'd be terrified." He smiled faintly. "You were, but you didn't let it own you." Clara nodded. The light shifted again, glinting off the polished floor. For a while, they stayed like that in the stillness, listening to the sounds of laughter drifting back into the courtyard, the world resuming its gentle rhythm. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but sure. "That chapter's over now." "Yes," he said, "and you ended it with grace." She looked up at the skylight, the same one she had restored with her own hands. The sunlight poured through it, pure and forgiving. For the first time, she didn't feel like someone rebuilding from ruin. She felt like someone who had built something unshakable. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the quiet and the gold, she knew no ghost from the past could reach her anymore. Outside, the last of the light faded into evening. The library stood strong and whole, and in its still heart, so did she. It was one of those quiet afternoons when time itself seemed to stretch. The restoration was nearly complete. The shelves stood proud again. The air no longer smelled of dust, but of old paper and polish. Outside, the Vermont sky was soft with the promise of rain. Clara was alone in the library, sorting through the last of the storage boxes they had kept sealed until now. She opened one gently. Inside were things too fragile to belong to the world outside: letters, ribbons, a few books wrapped in tissue, and then, at the bottom, a leather-bound journal, its edges worn smooth from years of touch. She hesitated, brushing her fingers across the faded cover. The initials P were pressed into it in gold. Margaret Pierce Alexander's mother. Clara sat down on the floor beside the box, cross-legged like a child who had found something sacred. She opened to the first page. The ink was thin, the handwriting elegant but unhurried. The entries were filled with reflections about art, the seasons, about the loneliness of a grand house after her husband's passing. But halfway through, one paragraph made Clara still completely. "I saw an exhibition today in Los Angeles. A young architect, Clara Bennett. Her work isn't just about space, but emotion. The way she shapes light feels almost like mercy. If she ever knew how much her designs move me, perhaps she'd understand that some of us are saved quietly by beauty." Clara's breath caught for a moment. All she could hear was the soft tick of the grandfather clock down the hall. Her throat tightened. The pages blurred as her eyes filled. She turned another page. There were sketches, her sketches, photographs clipped from old design magazines, with notes in the margins. If only Alexander could meet someone like her, someone who builds with heart. The realization settled over her like slow dawn. Margaret Pierce had known her, admired her, long before she ever set foot in Willowcrest, which meant Alexander. Her pulse quickened. She closed the journal, her hands trembling. Did he know? The sound of footsteps in the hall made her look up. Alexander appeared in the doorway, holding a folder, his expression easy at first until he saw the journal in her lap. Then his face changed, softened into something both tender and cautious. "You found it," he said quietly. Clara stood, the book clutched to her chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" He took a slow breath. "Because it wasn't my story to tell." "She wrote about me," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before we met, she admired my work." "Yes," he said, stepping closer. "She saw your exhibit years ago. It was the last trip she made before she got sick. She came home talking about you for weeks. I didn't realize who you were until the night of the gala." Clara shook her head, her thoughts tangled. "So, you knew me before all this I knew of you," he corrected gently. "But not you, not like this." She turned away, walking toward the window. "It changes things," she murmured. "All this time, I thought we met by chance. That this was pure. It was chance," he said softly. "I didn't invite you here because of her. I invited you because the work you did that night, the way you stood your ground, it reminded me of what she used to say. That some people carry light even when they're broken." Clara's eyes stung. "That sounds like something she'd write," she whispered. He smiled faintly. It was a quiet settled between them, the kind that wasn't empty, but full, dense with memory and unspoken truth. She opened the journal again, reading aloud another line. If kindness had a shape, it would look like someone rebuilding what the world tried to erase. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clara said softly, "She understood things I didn't even know how to say." "She did," Alexander replied, "and she would have loved you for it." Clara turned to him then, her expression softer, the edge of hurt giving way to something gentler. "You kept her alive in this place," she said. "Every inch of this library, it's her heartbeat." He nodded slowly. "She believed that beauty was a form of faith, that if you preserve it, even after loss, you're keeping something sacred alive." Clara ran her hand over the cover again. She was right. Outside, rain began to fall, a soft, steady rhythm against the glass. It filled the silence between them, a sound like forgiveness. Alexander reached out, his hand resting lightly on the table beside hers. "Not touching, just near enough. I didn't mean to keep it from you," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to see this place through your own eyes, not hers." "I do," Clara said, looking at him. "But now I see her in it too. And maybe that's how it was meant to be." He smiled, the kind of smile that held both sorrow and peace. She would have liked that. The rain deepened, the room grew dim, wrapped in that golden gray light that comes only before dusk. Clara sat back down and opened the journal again. She turned to the last entry. The ink was lighter there, as though the hand that wrote it had trembled. "If someday someone restores this room, I hope they do it with love, because love leaves fingerprints the way time leaves dust quietly, everywhere." Clara whispered the words to herself, her voice catching on the last syllable. She looked up at Alexander, her eyes glistening. She knew, she said, even then. He nodded. "Maybe she was waiting for you." They stood there in the fading light, surrounded by shelves of books and the faint hum of rain. The moment felt almost sacred, as if two lives, one gone, one still healing, had just found their meeting point. Clara placed the journal gently back on the table. She left more than memories here. She said she left a map. Alexander's voice was soft. To what? To how we keep going. Outside, the rain slowed, turning to mist. The world beyond the window blurred, as if time itself had taken a breath. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Willowcrest, Clara didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like she belonged not because of the past, but because she'd finally made peace with it. The clock chimed 6, somewhere deep in the house. The piano sounded a single note, low and warm. Clara closed the journal and smiled faintly. "She's still here," she said. Alexander looked toward the shelves. "Yes," he whispered. "She always will be." And in that quiet, with rain fading into evening and memory folding into the present, Clara realized something simple and true. Some people leave light behind not to guide us back, but to help us find our own way forward. The first snow of the season had barely melted when the idea began to take shape. Clara stood by the tall windows of Willowcrest, looking out at the open fields below, where sunlight caught on the frost and turned everything silver. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost. She was thinking about what she could build. It had started as a conversation, late one night, over tea in the library. Alexander had been leafing through one of his mother's journals, the one filled with sketches of her dream projects, libraries, community gardens, spaces meant to bring people together. He had looked at Clara then and said, if she were alive, she'd want to see this light spread beyond these walls. Clara remembered staring at the candle flickering between them, her heart beating quietly. "There's something I've always wanted to do," she said. "Something I never thought I'd have the courage to try." Alexander listened without interrupting. "I want to create a place," she continued, where people can make art without judgment, where children can paint on walls, where adults can remember what it's like to dream again. He didn't hesitate. Then let's build it. And just like that, the Pine Grove Art Center was born first as an idea, then as sketches, and soon as something real. They found the perfect spot a few miles outside town, a rundown barn at the edge of a field surrounded by tall pines. The roof sagged, the walls were tired, but the bones were strong. Clara saw beauty in it the moment she stepped inside. She closed her eyes and imagined what it could become: wide windows to let in light, long tables for children's hands, soft corners filled with laughter and color. Alexander stood beside her, his breath visible in the cold air. "It'll take work," he said. She smiled. "Good. I'm not afraid of work anymore." The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of hammers, paint, and plans. Local carpenters offered their time. Retired teachers dropped by with old easels. Even the kids from town came to help sweep the floors. Clara felt something inside her come alive, the kind of purpose that isn't loud, but steady, like a heartbeat rediscovered. Every morning, she arrived early, her boots crunching on frost, carrying coffee and blueprints. She'd trace lines in chalk, laugh with volunteers, make lists of colors that felt like hope. And in the evenings, when the sky turned pink over the trees, she'd stand in the doorway and watch the last light fade, her hands still streaked with paint. It wasn't just a project, it was a resurrection. Sometimes, when she looked up and saw Alexander watching from a distance, hands in his pockets, that quiet smile on his face, she felt an ache she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, affection, maybe both. He never interfered, never tried to lead. He just showed up when needed to lift a beam, to bring supplies, to remind her with a look that he believed in her more than anyone ever had. One afternoon, as they stood inside the half-finished building, he handed her a folded piece of paper. "I had our foundation file the permit," he said. "You're officially the director." Clara froze. "Alexander, I don't." He shook his head gently. "This was always yours. I just helped clear the path." Her throat tightened. For so long, every success she'd had been tied to someone else's name. But this was hers, her work, her dream, her signature on the plans, her vision in every wall. When the grand opening came in spring, the whole town showed up. Children ran through the doors first, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. An elderly man stood at the window, whispering, "It smells like my old schoolhouse." Volunteers wept quietly when they saw the mural's swirls of color, names of local artists, fragments of poetry painted into the beams. Clara walked through the crowd slowly, every sound and face imprinting itself into her memory. At the far end of the hall, she saw Alexander standing alone, watching her. Their eyes met, and she smiled. He mouthed one word: proud. After the ceremony, when the guests had gone and only the quiet hum of night remained, Clara walked outside. The building glowed behind her, warm against the dark. She wrapped her coat tighter and looked up at the stars. Alexander joined her a moment later. Neither spoke for a while. The air smelled like pine and rain. "Finally," he said, "you've given this town something it didn't know it needed." Clara smiled softly. "No, it gave something to me first. A chance to start over." He nodded, looking out at the lights spilling from the windows. "Your mother would have been proud." Clara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the golden glow of the center. "So would yours." They stood there, side by side, the night stretching open around them. Somewhere inside, music played soft piano notes, someone practicing for tomorrow's class. It sounded imperfect but full of joy. Clara's heart swelled. "You know," she said quietly, "for years I thought survival was enough, but now I think I'm finally living." Alexander turned to her, his gaze steady. "You are?" She laughed, a quiet, breathless sound, like something uncoiling after too long. They watched as the lights in the art center dimmed one by one, leaving only the glow of the sign out front hand-painted by the children, uneven but beautiful. Pine Grove Art Center. Beneath it, a smaller line read, "Where light is built by hand." Clara traced the words with her eyes. "She would have loved that," she whispered, thinking of Margaret Pierce. Alexander nodded. "She already does." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of paint, sawdust, and something new, something alive. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. For the first time in years, it didn't hurt to dream. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost a promise. "Let's keep building, Alexander. Not just places, but lives." He smiled. "That's exactly what we're doing." And in the hush that followed, beneath the whisper of pine branches and the heartbeat of the world moving forward, Clara realized the truth she'd been waiting her whole life to understand. Rebuilding isn't about forgetting what was broken. It's about teaching the cracks to let the light in. The center glowed behind them, steady and bright, as if the stars themselves had decided to stay a little closer to Earth that night. The days at Pine Grove settled into a calm rhythm. Children's laughter filled the hallways, paintbrushes tapped against glass jars, and sunlight filtered through wide windows Clara had designed herself. It was the sound of life moving forward, soft, imperfect, human. She often stayed after hours, walking alone through the echoing rooms, watching how the late light touched the walls. It always reminded her that healing wasn't loud. It was quiet work, the kind that happened in silence. One evening, as she locked up the front door, a voice called her name, faint, uncertain. "Clara." She turned. A woman stood near the gate, clutching her coat tight. It took Clara a second to recognize her Sophie Lane. The last time she'd seen her was the night at the Gala, when the world had come apart under glittering chandeliers. Sophie looked nothing like the woman Clara remembered. Her hair was limp, her eyes ringed with fatigue, her voice trembled. "I know I shouldn't be here." Clara didn't move closer, but she didn't turn away either. "Why are you?" Sophie swallowed hard. "It's Jonathan. He's not well." The air between them stilled. The sound of wind brushed through the pines behind them. "He's drinking again," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "He's angry. At everyone. At you. He keeps saying he'll make you regret leaving him." She hesitated, tears bright in her eyes. "I think he's capable of something terrible." Clara's first instinct was a sharp pulse of fear, the old kind, the one that used to live in her bones. But it passed quickly, replaced by something steadier. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Sophie nodded, her hands shaking. "I didn't know where else to go. He blames me too now, for everything. I tried to help him, but he's not the same man." Clara studied her quietly. There was no anger left, no resentment, just a strange, gentle pity. "He never really was," she said softly. For a long moment, Sophie said nothing. Then she whispered, "You don't seem afraid." Clara looked up at the fading sky, streaked with violet and silver. "I was, once, but fear only works when you give it a home." Sophie pressed her lips together, as if trying to hold herself from crying. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything." Clara stepped forward, just enough to touch her arm. "Then let that be enough." She said, "Go. Start again." Away from him. Sophie nodded, tears falling freely now. "You really forgave him, didn't you?" "No," Clara said gently. "I just stopped needing to." The wind moved again, lifting the scent of pine and rain. Sophie left soon after, disappearing into the dusk like a shadow, finally ready to rest. Clara watched her go until the road was empty, then turned back toward the glowing windows of Pine Grove. Inside, the silence was kind. She walked through the studio, fingertips brushing against the tables where paint still stained the wood. She thought about Jonathan, not as the man who had broken her life, but as someone still trapped in the wreckage of his own. It was strange, the way compassion could live beside memory. A week later, the news came, It was a small headline buried in the local paper, Jonathan Reed charged in corporate fraud investigation. There was a photo of him being led away, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Clara read the article once, slowly, then folded the paper and set it aside. She waited for the ache to come, the anger, the satisfaction something. But there was only quiet. That night, she sat alone in the courtyard behind Pine Grove. The sky was full of stars. The same stars that had once looked indifferent now seemed softer somehow. She closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds, the crickets, the wind, the distant laughter of two teenagers walking home. Alexander found her there an hour later. He didn't say anything at first, just draped his coat over her shoulders. "I heard," he said finally. Clara nodded. "I thought I'd feel something stronger. And you don't." She shook her head. "Just peace." He looked at her, his expression unreadable but full of quiet respect. "That's stronger than anything else." They sat together in silence. The air was cool, fragrant with pine. After a while, Clara spoke again. "Do you ever wonder what happens to people like him? The ones who can't let go?" Alexander took a long breath. "I think they stay where they are. The world moves, but they don't." She looked at him, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "I did that once." He smiled back, "And then you didn't." For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the stars bright above them. The world hushed in that soft, in-between space where forgiveness begins to sound like freedom. Clara leaned back, her gaze drifting upward. "You know," she said quietly, "there was a time when I thought the only way to heal was to forget. But now I think it's the remembering that saves us. The honest kind, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore." Alexander nodded slowly. "That's how you turn pain into wisdom." She looked at him, warmth in her eyes. "You sound like your mother." He laughed softly. "I'll take that as a compliment." The night deepened, the lights from Pine Grove casting golden reflections across the field. Inside, the children's paintings still lined the walls bright, wild, imperfect. Little bursts of courage captured in color. Clara stood, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. "Tomorrow's the art fair," she said. "The first one we've hosted. I want to be here early, make sure everything's ready." He rose beside her. "I'll bring coffee. You always do." They smiled at each other, small and genuine. As they walked back toward the path, Clara glanced over her shoulder one last time. The stars shimmered above the roofline, the pine trees whispering softly in the dark. Somewhere out there, a chapter had closed without noise, without vengeance, only stillness. And for the first time, she understood what true freedom felt like, not the absence of pain, but the quiet certainty that it no longer owned her. She whispered into the night, more to herself than anyone else. Let him find peace too, someday. The wind carried her words away, scattering them through the trees. Then she turned toward the light, her steps steady, her heart unburdened. The morning of the Willowcrest reopening arrived with the kind of stillness that comes before a great unveiling. Mist hung low over the hills, soft and silver, wrapping the estate in quiet grace. Clara stood at the edge of the long drive, her breath visible in the cold air, watching as the first guests began to arrive. Cars rolled up one by one, elegant, polished, filled with people whose faces she remembered from another life. People who once whispered about her at parties. People who had seen her fall, but today, she didn't feel small, not anymore. The library stood behind her, its tall windows gleaming, the restored stone glowing gold beneath the morning sun. Every inch of it carried her touch from the carved banisters to the skylight she'd rebuilt with her own hands. It wasn't just a building anymore, it was a resurrection. She walked inside, the click of her heels soft against the polished floors. The scent of cedar and paper filled the air. Light poured through the new glass above, warm and generous. Around her, guests murmured in admiration, their words floating like music. "It's breathtaking. Look at the detail. Who designed this? Someone answered, Clara Bennett. Her name, spoken with respect, not pity. She paused for a moment, letting that sink in. Alexander found her near the grand staircase, dressed in a charcoal suit that made his presence seem both grounded and timeless. He smiled when he saw her, that quiet, steady smile that had come to mean everything. They're speechless, he said. She laughed softly. That's a first. He leaned closer. You did this. Clara, every beam, every shadow. You brought this place back to life. She looked around, her voice almost a whisper. No. It healed me while I worked. Maybe we saved each other. The event began soon after. Guests gathered in the great hall, champagne glasses in hand, the air buzzing with low conversation. Alexander stepped up to the small stage near the hearth, the flicker of the fire catching the lines of his face. When he spoke, the room quieted instantly. Willowcrest, he began, has always been more than a house. It's a keeper of memory. My mother once called it her cathedral of thought. But for years after she passed, it became something else, a monument to loss. He paused, glancing toward Clara, until someone walked in and reminded me that light doesn't die. It just waits for the right hands to uncover it again. A murmur swept through the crowd. Clara felt her throat tighten. Alexander continued. Clara Bennett didn't just restore this library, she restored its spirit. She taught all of us here what it means to rebuild not from vanity or pride, but from faith. Faith in beauty, in purpose, in second chances. He stepped aside then, motioning for her to join him. She hesitated only a heartbeat before walking forward. Applause filled the hall. It wasn't loud, not thunderous, it was warm, rising like wind through the trees. Standing beside him, Clara looked out over the faces, the familiar, the curious, the once judgmental. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even nervous. She was simply present. She spoke quietly, her voice carrying not through force, but through stillness. There was a time when I thought broken things should be hidden, she said. But I've learned that what's broken can become something beautiful if you're brave enough to face it. This place, this library, was once a ruin, and so was I. Her eyes met Alexander's for a moment. He gave a small nod, but she continued. The cracks let the light in. And now, it belongs to all of us again. The applause came again, fuller this time, rising like a wave. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She could only feel it, the warmth of it, wrapping around her like sunlight after years of shadow. After the ceremony, the guests wandered through the rooms, touching the railings, admiring the craftsmanship. Clara moved quietly among them, answering questions, accepting compliments with humility. Someone asked if she would take on more projects like this. She smiled. Maybe. But some works aren't meant to be repeated. They're meant to stand as reminders. Near the end of the afternoon, she found herself alone again in the library. The crowd's laughter drifted from the courtyard, but here, it was peaceful. She ran her fingers along the edge of a shelf, feeling the grain of the wood, the tiny imperfections that made it real. She thought of her younger self, the woman who once stood humiliated under chandeliers, clutching a shattered glass. She wished she could tell that woman what was waiting beyond the pain. That dignity isn't taken from you. It's rediscovered in the silence after the noise. A faint reflection in the skylight caught her eye. Alexander was standing behind her, watching quietly. Do you realize, he said softly, that you've given this place more life than it's had in decades? Clara smiled, looking up at the light streaming through the glass. No, she said. It just needed someone to listen to what it wanted to become. He stepped closer, his voice low. You always did have a way of hearing things most people overlook. She turned toward him, the corners of her lips curving. Maybe I finally learned to listen to myself. He reached out, brushing his thumb gently across a faint streak of dust on her hand. You've built something lasting. Clara. She met his eyes. So have you. The room fell quiet again. The light shifted, golden and soft, wrapping them both in its calm. Outside, the guests began to leave, their laughter fading down the gravel drive. Inside, the fire flickered low. Clara stood by the tall window, watching the last of the daylight slide across the marble floor. The library glowed alive, whole, radiant, and for the first time, she realized something profound. She had become the thing she restored, not polished or perfect, but enduring. She turned to Alexander, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" He nodded, eyes warm. "It's everything it was meant to be." The wind moved softly through the open doorway, stirring the scent of old books and cedar. Clara smiled. "So are we." And in that moment, quiet, golden, and infinite, the library breathed again, and so did she. The chandeliers above the grand hall shimmered like constellations caught in crystal. Music drifted through the air, soft strings, polished laughter, the clink of glasses meeting in celebration. The Boston Museum of Art gleamed that evening, hosting a gala that drew the city's most accomplished names in design, philanthropy, and old money charm, and among them, moving through the crowd with quiet confidence, was Clara Bennett. Her gown was simple ivory silk that caught the light like calm water. Around her wrist, a thin gold bracelet gleamed, the same one she'd worn the night of the Willowcrest opening, a token of rebirth, of what had been reclaimed. Everywhere she turned, people greeted her. "Miss Bennett, congratulations on your recent feature. Your restoration work has become legend. Boston's lucky to have you." She smiled, gracious but grounded. Compliments no longer swelled her pride. They flowed through her like gentle rain. She was no longer performing, no longer proving. She was simply being. The museum walls carried her touch, the newly redesigned sculpture gallery she'd overseen, the interplay of light and texture she had insisted upon. Her name was now etched quietly on a plaque near the entrance architectural direction by Clara Bennett. She didn't linger near it. She didn't need to. Alexander arrived later, slipping through the crowd with his usual understated ease. When he reached her, his eyes softened. "You're glowing," he said. Clara laughed lightly. "It's the lighting. I designed it that way." He smiled. "You always did know how to make a room breathe." They talked, surrounded by the low hum of conversation, the orchestra swelling gently behind them. Every so often, Clara caught sight of familiar faces from the Los Angeles days, the same faces that had once looked away when Jonathan shattered her life in public. Some approached her now, polite, rehearsed. "Clara, it's been ages. We're so proud of what you've done." She met each one with kindness, not pretense. "Thank you," she'd say. "It's been a journey." And then she'd move on. Halfway through the evening, as she walked toward the exhibit hall, a man brushed past her carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Her gaze lifted out of habit and froze. Jonathan Reed. For a heartbeat. The world went quiet. He was thinner now. The sharp confidence once in his eyes was gone, replaced by something hollow. His hair was grayer, his suit ill-fitted. There was a tremor in his hands as he balanced the tray. He noticed her at the same moment. The glass in his grasp clinked faintly against another. For a second, he seemed unsure whether to hide or speak. But then his eyes dropped. Clara felt no surge of hatred, no rush of revenge, just stillness. He approached slowly, as though walking through the memory of who they once were. "Clara," he said, his voice cracked but low. "I heard about your work, about the center, the library." She studied him, not unkindly. "I know." He swallowed. "I didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was final. Jonathan looked down, his jaw tightening as if bracing for scorn. "You have every reason to hate me." Clara tilted her head slightly. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "I don't—" He blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. "I don't hate you, Jonathan. she continued. "I don't carry you anywhere in me anymore." His lips parted, but no words came. "I've forgiven you," she said softly, "but not for your sake, for mine. And now?" She paused, eyes steady on his. "I've forgotten you." It wasn't cruel. It was liberation spoken aloud. Jonathan's breath faltered. The tray in his hands shook slightly. "You really mean that?" She nodded. "Yes, I do." He stood there for a long moment, shoulders caving inward. Then, quietly, he bowed his head. "You always were stronger than I knew." Clara smiled faintly. "No, Jonathan, I just stopped letting you decide who I was." Someone from the catering team called his name from across the hall. He hesitated, then gave her one last look, half sorrow, half respect, and walked away. The crowd swallowed him, and just like that, the past dissolved. Clara exhaled slowly, her heartbeat steady. For years she had dreamed of closure, imagined confrontation as fire and fury. But now she realized it was nothing like that. Closure wasn't loud, it was quiet, almost gentle, like a door closing softly behind you after years of noise. Alexander found her a few minutes later near the marble staircase. He noticed the slight change in her expression, the stillness in her eyes. "You saw him, didn't you?" She nodded. "Are you all right?" She smiled, her voice low. "I think I finally am." He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. He just offered his arm, and she took it. They walked together through the gallery, past sculptures and light and reflections of themselves on glass. Around them, the music swelled again, soft strings, familiar and full, as they paused beneath a towering skylight. Alexander looked at her. "It's strange, isn't it? The way life circles back, the way you can meet your past and not flinch." Clara's gaze lingered on the stars visible through the glass above. "Maybe that's how you know you're free," she said. He studied her face, the calm strength there. "You've come full circle." She turned to him, her eyes warm. "No, I've come home." The orchestra shifted to a waltz, and without speaking, he held out his hand. She placed hers in his, and they began to dance slow, unhurried, the world fading around them. Clara moved easily now, her steps guided not by memory, but by presence. The music filled the hall, the chandeliers glittered above, and the woman who had once been broken beneath them now danced beneath their light, untouched, radiant, whole. As the song came to its close, she leaned in slightly and whispered, "It's strange. I thought this night would feel like an ending." Alexander smiled, his hand tightening gently around hers. "Maybe it's just another beginning." Outside, snow had started to fall over Boston. White flakes drifted against the museum windows, quiet and forgiving. Clara looked out at them, her heart steady. The past was behind her, not erased, but transformed, its weight turned to wisdom, its pain into peace, and somewhere in that gentle snowfall, a chapter ended not with anger, but with grace. The afternoon sun hung low over Willow Crest, casting a soft golden hue across the courtyard. The vines that trailed along the stone walls were touched with early autumn, hints of amber and rust weaving between the green. Clara stood by the fountain, her reflection rippling in the water as the world around her seemed to hum quietly with peace. It had been a year since the night at the museum, a year since she'd said goodbye to the last ghost of her past, and somehow, without realizing it, she'd begun to live as if she were born anew. The library had become a haven for visitors from across the state. Children came for art programs, scholars for research, travelers for the quiet beauty of it all. But for Clara, it was more than that. It was proof that something broken could become magnificent again. She often found herself there, sketching alone by the tall windows as the afternoon light shifted, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who finally trusted her own rhythm. That was where Alexander found her that day. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her from the doorway, a soft smile on his face. She looked up and met his gaze, warmth blooming quietly between them. "You've been standing there too long," she said, her voice teasing but gentle. "I didn't want to interrupt," he replied. "You look peaceful." She smiled, setting down her pencil. "That's new for me." He stepped closer, the floor creaking faintly under his weight. "You've earned it." They stood together in the golden hush, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Then Alexander reached into his coat pocket, hesitated for a breath, and drew out a small, worn leather box. Clara blinked, surprised. "What's that?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened it slowly, revealing an antique pocket watch. The metal was soft with age, its face delicate, its engraving faint but elegant. He turned it in his hand, and light caught on the surface. "This," he said quietly, "belonged to my mother." Clara's breath caught. She carried it everywhere. He continued, "Even when it stopped working." She said it reminded her that time isn't meant to be perfect. It just has to move forward. He placed the watch in Clara's palm. "I had it restored, and I had something added." She turned it over. On the back, engraved in graceful letters, were the words, "She wasn't waiting to be saved, she was learning to fly." The world seemed to still around her. Her thumb traced the letters slowly, reverently. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It reminded me of you," he said simply. Their eyes met. In his gaze, there was no urgency, no demand, just a quiet truth, offered freely. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something tender beneath it, a tremor of hope. "Not because I need an answer right now, but because I need you to know what's in my heart." He paused, taking a steady breath. "Clara Bennett, will you marry me?" The words hung in the air, not grand, not dramatic, just honest. The kind of question born from love that had learned to wait. Clara looked down at the watch again, her reflection curved in its glass. The woman staring back wasn't the one who had once stood trembling under chandeliers. She wasn't someone's shadow anymore. She was whole, and yet she felt something stir a mix of tenderness and hesitation. She closed the box gently, then looked up at him. "Alexander," she said softly, "you've given me more than I ever knew I needed. You gave me space to rebuild, to breathe, to believe again." He smiled faintly, "Then say yes." She shook her head, her eyes kind but firm. "Not yet?" He blinked, surprised but not wounded. "When I say yes," she continued, "I want it to come from a place completely my own. No ghosts, no old fears, just freedom, the kind that doesn't need permission anymore." He was silent for a long moment, studying her face. Then, quietly, he nodded. "Then I'll wait." She exhaled, relief and affection mingling in her chest. "You always do?" He smiled. "I don't mind waiting for something real." They stood there, the late sunlight washing over them both. In her hand, the pocket watch glinted softly, the ticking faint but steady a heartbeat of its own. Clara looked down at it again and said, almost to herself, she was learning to fly. Alexander tilted his head. "And did she?" She looked up, a small, luminous smile spreading across her lips. "She's still learning." Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and sea salt from the nearby coast. The leaves rustled, a whisper of time moving forward. Alexander reached out, his fingers brushing hers. "Then let's keep learning together." Clara nodded, her heart quiet and full. There was no rush, no need to define what they were becoming. The beauty was in the waiting, the shared understanding that love wasn't about rescue or possession. It was about space, about patience. They walked out into the courtyard, the sky streaked with pink and gold. The fountain murmured softly beside them. Clara glanced at him and said, "Do you ever think we meet people at the exact moment we're ready to see them?" He looked at her with that steady warmth she had come to trust. "I think the right people don't save us. They remind us who we already were." She smiled, eyes glimmering in the fading light. Then you did exactly that. They stopped near the fountain. The water reflected the sky, shifting with color and light. Clara opened the watch once more and listened to its quiet ticking. Each second seemed to fold into the next, unrushed, alive, perfectly imperfect. Alexander's hand brushed against hers again, but he didn't hold it tightly, just enough to be there. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. Freedom wasn't about being alone. It was about choosing, every day, to walk beside someone without losing yourself along the way. She closed the watch, slipped it into her pocket, and smiled softly. "When I'm truly free," she said, looking up at him, "you'll know, because I'll say yes." He nodded once, simply, "Then I'll keep listening." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The air cooled, but the warmth between them lingered. Two lives, once broken and rebuilt, now standing side by side, patient, steady, unafraid. And as twilight settled over Willow Crest, the sound of the ticking watch blended with the rustle of the leaves, a quiet reminder that love, like time, doesn't need to be rushed. It just has to move forward. It was a quiet morning at Boston Logan Airport, the kind of morning when everything felt suspended, neither beginning nor ending, just existing. Planes rolled down the runway in the distance, their engines humming like a low, constant heartbeat. Inside the terminal, travelers shuffled with coffee cups in hand, half awake, half lost in thought. Jonathan Reed adjusted his driver's cap and stood near the arrivals gate, holding a small placard with a client's name on it. His uniform was clean, pressed, though worn at the seams. He looked older now, his hair almost white, his shoulders less square, but there was a calmness in his face that hadn't been there before. Life had a way of sanding down the sharp edges. He had long since stopped chasing the noise of ambition. These days, he found comfort in the simplicity of small things, the first light over the tarmac, the smell of jet fuel and morning rain, the brief, human moments in between flights. He'd learned to listen more than he spoke, to breathe more than he regretted. That morning, he was assigned to pick up 2 passengers from a private flight arriving from Vermont. When the couple stepped through the sliding doors, the name on his card faded from his mind, because he knew them instantly, Clara Bennett and Alexander Pierce. They didn't see him at first. They moved with the quiet ease of people who no longer needed to be seen. Clara wore a long camel coat, her hair pulled back loosely. Time had softened her, but not dulled her. There was a grace to her stillness, the kind that came from surviving storms and learning how to stand in sunlight again. Alexander walked beside her, holding her hand, not as a claim, but as a companion. They looked ordinary 2 travelers in love, laughing at something only they understood. Yet to Jonathan, they seemed like something out of a painting. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, unsure what to do. Then Clara glanced his way. Their eyes met. It wasn't shock that crossed her face. It was recognition, calm, unhurried, as if she had expected that someday, somewhere, the world would bring them face to face again. Jonathan felt words rise and die in his throat. There was so much he could have said. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. You deserved better." But instead, he simply gave her a small, genuine smile, the kind that came from surrender, not shame. Clara's lips curved in return, just a faint, quiet smile. And in that exchange 1 second, no more the past untangled itself. No anger, no bitterness, just release. Jonathan bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect, and turned to load their luggage into the car. The leather bag was worn, but well-loved, marked with faint paint stains that looked almost like brush strokes. He recognized her touch even in that. As he opened the door for them, Clara paused. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice was warm, the same tone that used to fill their old home when she was humming to herself over coffee. Jonathan nodded. "Safe travels, ma'am." Their eyes met once more. There was peace there, his and hers. As the car pulled away, Jonathan watched it merge into the morning traffic until it disappeared down the long stretch of road leading out of the airport. The sky was pale blue now, the kind that promised a gentle day. He let out a slow breath. Something inside him settled. Meanwhile, in the back seat, Clara looked out the window. The city glided by streets, faces, light flickering across glass. She saw their reflection in the car window, her and Alexander side by side. The years between them folded into something simple and true. Alexander glanced at her. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her eyes still on the sky. "Yes." "More than all right." He squeezed her hand gently. "You didn't seem surprised to see him." "I wasn't," she said after a moment. "I think I stopped running from the past a long time ago. It has a way of finding you when you're finally ready to look it in the eye." He smiled, quiet and proud. Outside, the morning light spilled through the windshield, touching her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting it warm her skin. In that silence, her mind drifted back to the night of the gala years ago. The shattered glass, the cruel laughter. The woman she was then felt like a stranger now. Clara opened her eyes again, exhaling slowly. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think victory meant proving everyone wrong. But I think it's just this." Alexander turned toward her. She smiled faintly. "Waking up, living quietly, loving without needing to win." He nodded, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "That sounds like freedom to me." "It is," she whispered. They drove in silence after that, the kind of silence filled with meaning rather than absence. The city gave way to the open road, the hum of tires steady against the pavement. At one point, Clara opened the pocket watch Alexander had given her years ago. The soft ticking filled the air between them. The engraving on the back caught the sunlight. She wasn't waiting to be saved, she was learning to fly. And she realized she had, not through grand gestures or perfect endings, but through the quiet courage of continuing. She closed the watch gently and looked out the window again. The world moved past airports, highways, endless sky, life, unhurried, imperfect, alive. Somewhere behind them, Jonathan was probably watching another flight take off. Somewhere ahead, new days waited, unpromised but open. Clara smiled, because she finally understood winning wasn't about triumph. It was about peace. It was about being able to look at what once broke you and whisper, "Thank you." As the car turned down the road leading toward the coast, sunlight spilled across the dashboard. The ocean came into view, wide and glimmering, the horizon soft as a breath. Clara rolled down her window. The wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of salt and pine. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting it all in. Alexander reached over, resting his hand gently on hers. No words, just presence. And for a long, quiet moment, they simply drove two souls who had learned that the greatest kind of love isn't what saves you. It's what lets you live. The road stretched ahead, open and bright. Clara smiled once more, the sound of the ticking watch steady in her palm, and whispered, "Some things don't need endings." Then she leaned back, eyes on the horizon, and let the light carry her forward. Sometimes, life breaks us in ways we never saw coming. But pain, when faced with grace, can become the quiet teacher that shapes who we are meant to be. Clara's story reminds us that dignity is not something others can take. It's something we choose to keep, even when the world tries to strip it away. We all carry moments of loss, betrayal, or regret. Yet true strength isn't in fighting to prove our worth. It's in learning to rise with gentleness, to forgive without forgetting, and to walk forward without bitterness. Healing is not about returning to who we were, it's about becoming someone wiser, softer, and freer. As the years pass, what remains is not the applause or the pain, but the peace that comes from living truthfully. The victory isn't in revenge or success, it's in being able to look back at your scars and feel gratitude instead of anger. Because, in the end, a meaningful life is not about being saved, it's about learning to fly with quiet courage, open hands, and a heart that still believes in light. Thank you, dear listeners, for spending this quiet moment with us and walking through Clara's journey of strength and grace. If her story touched your heart or reminded you of the beauty of starting over, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing heartfelt stories that remind us all, no matter our age or past, it's never too late to heal, to love, and to live with dignity. Until the next story, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep shining.